Thank you so much for taking the time to be part of this webinar today. My name is Martin Leng. I'm the head of communications at the Brussels Institute for Geopolitics. For those of you who don't know the Brussels Institute for Geopolitics, we are the only think tank in Brussels dedicated wholly to geopolitics and strategy. And so it's quite understandable that we'll be marking today with this webinar conversation to mark the 4th anniversary of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. What was once unthinkable, a land war in Europe, is now a daily reality, a reality which manages to evoke both the horrors of our past in the form of things like trench warfare, but also offers an unwelcome glimpse into the future of conflict through the use of drones and such. The war is an epochal event in itself, but also a prism through which many geopolitical developments must now be assessed, not least the present turbulence in the transatlantic security order, as well as the wake-up call which Europe's strategic autonomy has experienced in recent months. Now, of course, the Ukraine war predates February 2022, with the annexation of Crimea and the occupation of the Donbass already over a decade old. The war is often discussed in strategic terms, but it's worth taking a moment before we begin to remember the human toll of the conflict. Well over 500,000 dead and wounded military personnel from Ukraine, as well as surging civilian casualties. But behind the tragedy of the war, there is also a story of incredible resilience, a modern-day David and Goliath story with ingenuity in the face of brutality, courage in the face of destruction, and tenacious hope of a European future for Ukraine, despite the shortcomings of realpolitik. Now, it's this intersection of resilience and realpolitik that we'll be discussing today. And for this, we're joined by 3 expert voices to take stock of the situation, both on the ground and in the international corridors of power. Our guests are Mariana Budjeryn, a senior researcher at the MIT Center for Nuclear Security Policy and a respected thought leader on international security matters. Ed Arnold, the senior research fellow for European security at the Royal United Services Institute in the UK. He has extensively researched the evolving Euro-Atlantic security architecture in the context of the war. And Oleksandra Azarkhina, who is a Ukrainian policy expert currently leading efforts to bolster her country's economic security, but formerly the Deputy Minister for Communities, Territories, and Infrastructure Development of Ukraine. I'd like to thank all of the speakers and our guests for being with us today. A quick reminder to please keep yourself muted so as not to disrupt the conversation as much as possible, and that there'll be an opportunity to ask questions to our panel at the end of the discussion. These questions can be submitted through Zoom's chat function, and we'll be selecting a few for our panel. So without further ado, let's begin. And I'd like to start with questions to the panel regarding the current state of play. Now, on one side, Russia continues to aggrandize the seizures of small villages and fields to influence the ongoing negotiations by giving the impression of progress. On the flip side, Ukrainian forces are still managing to inflict heavy personnel losses, although without any significant change in the front line. Kiev is still subject to Moscow's war of attrition, with political backing from Washington seemingly less secure than ever. Meanwhile, reaching a peace agreement seems to be hard enough, even without taking into account the maximalist and relatively unchanged demands from Moscow. So with that context in mind, I'd like to turn first to Oleksandra Azarkhina. You have first-hand experience within Ukraine's wartime government as a minister. And at this challenging moment in the conflict, with the targeting of energy infrastructure, complicated peace negotiations, and of course, the recent veto by Hungary of a loan to Ukraine, my question is, how do you assess the country's resilience at this time? And is the country's resilience reaching its limits?
We're just reading news now. So the Council of the EU approves to ask for 90 billion Ukraine loan, third block by Hungary. So still good news for us. And I hope we're going to have much more good news, even with the fact that today obviously isn't a day of celebration. But still, we are entering the 5th year of the war. I can tell you that now sitting here in Kiev, there is a mood around the approach of the spring. And it's really something which we can, very emotionally, but really refer to how it feels here. Even with the fact that it's 4 years of the war, this period was specifically important because in somehow, like a Russian mythology against Ukraine, it was not the nuclear as an ultimate weapon, it was the cold. So Putin already used his worst weapon against us, which is attacks on our energy infrastructure, and he lost. And we're still surviving. And sorry for being probably, too enthusiastic or too emotional around it, but that's the mood. The spring is approaching. I can give you details or the fact age if you would ask me to.
Okay. And tell us a little bit more about what does Ukraine need now going forward? Obviously, resilience is important, but resilience doesn't exist in a vacuum. It depends on internal resources and external support. What does Ukraine need to continue to resist?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So yesterday there was a release of the so-called RDNA 4. So it's evaluation of all the losses which Ukraine got during this time of the full-scale invasion. It was prepared both with the World Bank, EU Commission, UNDP, and it's more than a half of the trillion. It's incredible numbers, and obviously the understanding of the whole losses we have, it's just like impossible to see how we can cover it even with this optimistic type of the financing we get from the EU. But basically, when we're looking into the needs assessments for Ukraine, it always starts with the defense needs. Then we go into the critical infrastructure restoration, microfinancial aid. Again, one of the reasons, and you're definitely right, like talking about the resilience, yes, it's about the first of all of the spirit of the nation, but without the support from the allied nations since the beginning of the full-scale invasion to actually support the statehood, it wouldn't be, as stable as it's possible. We preserved the state, we even made it better. We were implementing the reforms, we keep implementing them. But again, even with the fact that I used to work in the ministry responsible for the restoration, we were always focusing on defense topics. And now there's, numbers quite allowed, which connects Ukraine's security to the Europe's security. And that's when I do believe our question can sound more understandable. The main priority for the defense needs is air defense. It's been like that since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. We were, let's say, not in the worst type of the situation regarding the air threats from the point of view that Russia weren't able to suppress us, but they are able to attack our energy infrastructure. They are able to terrorize the population. And yes, this winter was severe. And yes, we were very low with our energy generation. And to rebuild it will take a lot of time. But looking into the way Ukraine tackles it through the technological answer, through the type of the solutions we were able to provide to, answer this low-cost Shahid threats, etc., it actually also gives us a lot of them optimism. Going further, like looking into the numbers of the defense needs, that was quite a psychological moment as well when we started to talk not only on the defense, but we started to look into the necessity to attack the archer and not just the, bow. And you remember the discussions, how, difficult it was to push this case from Ukrainian side that we actually able and we have a right to attack the defense facilities on Russian territory, preventing the attacks happening on the civil infrastructure. Now it became already, the thing. So there was their change of the sanctuarity, or the reverse of the sanctuarity. And in addition to the fact that we are capable of providing meter and long distance strikes, we also have quite a lot of the successes on the sea domain. That's, from my point of view, one of the type of the victories Ukraine got during this war, which are untold story. So they're, like experts of course, they do know how it started with the Black Sea Grain Initiative, how it moved forward with the Ukrainian independent humanitarian corridor. And actually, we introduced the so-called like a sea denial doctrine. But I do believe that's really untold. And thinking about, like, again, wider type of the concepts where we are, of course, it's not like a Kiev for 3 days, but still it's a 4 years of the terrible war. And we have, tremendous losses, like not only from the infrastructure point of view, but the human resources losses. It's of course connected to everyone's lives for us who lives in Ukraine. But even with this fact, it's just a question, how do we define the victory? And what really cheers me up that with the recent changes in the Ministry of Defense, we got a minister who actually posed the question of Ukrainian victory. It's nothing, like else. It's really how do we win? What type of resources we need, and how we need to stop Russia here in Ukraine and prevent their further offensive on the West.
Thank you, Oleksandra. Maybe if I can turn to you, Edward, and indeed looking beyond Kiev to the situation on the battlefield, could you give us an assessment of the state of play on the ground? What are some of the major developments in recent months? Have there actually been any? There's often talk of a very static front line. And on the subject of the front line itself, what would a ceasefire which freezes the current lines mean in practice for Ukraine's sovereignty and its defense?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we're certainly in a pretty brutal attritional war, and the issue is that both sides have really exhausted a lot of their offensive potential. So whereas at previous times within the war, certainly after the invasion in 22, and then some very impressive dual counteroffensives by Ukraine in 23, that's where you sort of start to see big arrows maneuver on the map. That's really broken down. So although the lines are very static and have been very static for a long time, there's been a lot of changes in terms of technological changes, future of warfare, very drone heavy environments at the moment, because again, both sides lack that offensive potential, and it's a key consideration for beyond Europe and or beyond Ukraine, certainly in Europe, of how much this is potentially representative of a wider or broader NATO versus Russia conflict, or it is one that is taking place due to it being really static and really some grim math. I mean, Russian losses at the moment assessed around 1.2 million casualties. Ukraine potentially half that number, but obviously a significant proportion on the Ukraine side, civilian casualties. And what we're seeing in the last couple of months is actually an increase in Russian casualties. So 30,000 in January alone, 35 in December, again, intelligence assessments. And I think when you're talking about resilience from a NATO or European perspective, I mean, just to put those in perspective, those numbers on the death toll per month on the Russian side, it's more than NATO has in its whole forward land forces posture within the Nordic, Baltic states and into Central and Eastern Europe. So the scale which is happening in Ukraine is really unprecedented, certainly in our institutional memory from a NATO perspective. And it's assessed that that's now exceeding the rate of Russian recruitment. And one of the key constraints on the Russian armed forces at the moment is just the quality of forces, that they are pretty poor. And within military means, if you want to do offensive maneuvers, certainly at a large scale, you need very good troops who are able to do an offensive maneuver. The Russians don't have that at all. I think also in terms of resilience, I mean, Ukraine was standing around 500 to 600 strikes per day, mainly on a lot on civilian infrastructure. Yet a couple of months ago, when 19 drones came over Poland and from Russia, sort of there were panics in NATO. There were Article 4 declarations. People were asking if it's Article 5. Again, it's just a completely different scale, and I think mentally it shows that NATO is just sort of not prepared for what Ukraine is experiencing. In some parts of the battlefield, I mean, the casualty rates as a ratio, I mean, Ukraine are effectively outkilling Russians by number of around 25 times, which is pretty significant in terms of how the calculus, both political and military, of the Ukrainians saying, well, what do we hold the ground? And the Russians have gone around 30 miles into Donetsk in the last 2 years. So something that NATO is assessing as a snail's pace, less than 1% of Ukrainian territory. So yes, the Russians are advancing exceptionally slowly, but they're paying a very, very high price. And in certain areas, the Ukrainian armed forces are relatively happy with that balance of where they can sort of hold off the Russians. And what you've seen very recently, in fact, is the fact that Starlink communication system turned off for the Russians then cannot hold the ground. So it does show how some tactical-ish changes on the battlefield actually could change the calculus. And Ukraine is under significant pressure, but thinks, believes that it can't give the impression that it is under that pressure or that it's losing, bearing in mind the political negotiation that is running in parallel to the military operation. And it's really all about the fortress belt in the east. So these are really significant defensive positions that Ukraine have been fighting over since 2014, and they need to hold on to them, because if they are forced under a political settlement to move further west, then everyone believes that the Russians are going to continue the operation. It might stop for a while, but the intent is there. They're spending 500 billion a year on defense, if you measure on purchasing power parity, and they're not putting everything into Ukraine as well. So the Russians want a more expansive war, likely. So I think, freezing the front line where they are would be difficult, but I think there's a calculus there politically. But then actually, ceding to some of the demands that we've seen in a variety of leaked reports over the last couple of months, and Ukraine giving up the fortress belt will put it in a significantly weakened position. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. And coming to you, Mariana, on the subject of the peace deal, Donald Trump recently established a June deadline for the agreement of a peace deal, although lots remains unclear, not least how the US's role will look given the present administration in Washington, and of course, how to reconcile what Ukraine, what Europe, what the United States may want with Russia's very maximalist demands. Could you maybe give us an overview of the state of the peace talks, what some of the sticking points are which are still in play, and the likely compromises that we're going to see in the months ahead?
Yes, Martin. Let me just start by expressing a deep sense of gratitude to those men and women who are on the front lines today in Ukraine and risking their life and limb to make sure we can all sit here and discuss these very important issues. So, we owe them all a deep debt of gratitude. The peace talks, as you know, have been into several rounds now. The original 28-point plan and the European counterproposal have morphed into something else, the 20-point plan. Currently, one encouraging thing that I noted is that there have been few leaks from the peace negotiations, and that is a cautiously optimistic sign that the sides are kind of encouraged to stick with it and possibly are interested in the conclusion of this peace deal. So they don't want to subvert it by leaking information into the public space and causing a discussion or a scandal or so forth. But equally, we know that there's some points of principle that are red lines for Ukraine and that would be very difficult to reconcile and cross. And that is, first and foremost, the question of territorial concessions. So what we understand is Russia wants that piece of the Donbass that it currently does not occupy. There has been some options, I guess, put on the table, including a free economic zone for kind of this gray zone between the two positions, which leaves a lot of questions, it raises more questions that it answers, of course, and that is who's going to be the sovereign there? Who's going to provide social services? Who's going to police and ensure security of the people? I mean, you just don't leave this chunk of land sort of unattended and without some kind of governance and oversight. And with that, what's connected to the question of territory and sovereignty is the issue of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. There's no agreement on that. That's Europe's largest nuclear power plant. It's been dormant since September 2022. All 6 reactors have been shut down, not producing electricity. It is currently receives its electricity from the Ukrainian grid, but of course there's an intention on the Russian part to connect it to the Russian grid. The previous a proposal in the previous versions of the peace plan to have some kind of 50-50 split of the output was clearly put forward by people who do not understand anything about how nuclear power plants work, and who haven't thought of the fact that now Ukrainian grid and Russian grid are completely disconnected. So Ukraine is part of the European grid, and so Russia has its own grid. There are different technical difficulties and frequencies and so forth that are involved in that. One thing that is not featuring in this latest version of the peace plan, and that has clearly been a concession on the Ukrainian part, is the issue of justice. If you remember, that was a very important part of Ukrainians' original proposal. If we do have peace, it should be a just peace. That means that the people who perpetrated war crimes, in Europe, on a continent that in 1945 said never again, those people will go unpunished, at least per, the terms of the settlement. And that's an issue, beyond Ukraine. It has broader European significance, and it goes to basically defining what kind of continent do we live in, what kind of rules do we live by. And of course, last and certainly not the least is the issue of security guarantees. Now, I understand that there has been some progress made, especially that the European partners are willing to deploy forces, military forces, allegedly put them on the ground in Ukraine. But the size of that contingent, the conditions in which they will be deployed, the roles that they would be playing, that at least is not information that I'm privy to, as is not, it's unclear what kind of role the United States will play in these security guarantees. Certainly nothing, put in beautiful writing will suffice. Ukraine learned the hard way that, the crux and the substance of the security guarantee is in the actual actions that it's going to precipitate, in the force deployment, in concrete commitments of defense assistance and technology transfers and joint defense projects, than in any documents signed, no matter at what level of leadership.
Thanks very much, Mariana. And I think that's a good moment to segue into the broader strategic picture, which obviously is dominated by the United States and what it will and will not do. In the past 12 months, Europe has experienced a sobering wake-up call. America appears not only to be disengaging from some of its traditional security commitments, but also actively waging an ideological war against pluralistic Europe through documents like the National Security Strategy. As you phrased it, Mariana, the question is, what kind of rules do we live by? It's somewhat clear to Europe that they're not necessarily our own. And on this point, the alignment from the White House with Putin's worldview seems to be both clear and somewhat alarming. And of course, any risk to European security has obvious implications for Ukraine's defense moving forward. So on that point, Ed, I would like to turn to you. Many have declared that the transatlantic security architecture is fundamentally dead in the water. Is that the case? And what does this rupture, as Mark Carney called it, mean for the Ukraine conflict? Can Europe deliver on its security guarantees to Kiev without the United States?
I mean, I think one of the questions is actually, can the Europeans deliver on their own security guarantees to themselves without the United States as well, which I will come on to. I mean, the first part, with the US, obviously, there's been a variety of speeches over the last couple of years, a variety of sort of policy turns. We've had the national security strategy, the national defense strategy. And I think the main point is to try and separate what is very US ideologically. Also, I think some of those speeches which were designed for a domestic audience. So Vice President Vance's Munich Security Conference speech last year, I think, was designed for a US domestic audience rather than a European audience. It just happened that the Europeans were in the room. So it's quite difficult to sort of cut through all of this to really realize what the US position is. But I think the general consensus is it's going to be unreliable from a European perspective for a long time. And, personally, I think a very long time as well. I do not think the US or the US Republican Party is going to go back to a Reaganite worldview anytime soon. But within that, you can sort of start to see snippets. I mean, while the national security strategy, national defense strategy is quite obviously a political manifesto, it's also very clear. Elbridge Colby's comments to the NATO defense ministers recently, again, very clear. I think the issue is the Europeans just don't quite like the message. When I was in uniform, I was at NATO in 2014 when Crimea happened. And again, the Europeans just did not get the message. We don't like the message, but at least I think we're getting it at the moment. So if the US is unreliable and will be for a long time, what can the Europeans do about it? I think specifically in terms of security guarantees to Ukraine, the Europeans cannot provide that on their own. It's very clear. And it's not just in terms of the physical aspects. So when you assess military power, it's about the physical, the conceptual, and the moral component. So physical, what you've got, conceptual, how you're going to use that, and then the moral component about leadership and ethical foundation, etc. And I think one of the issues in terms of deterrence is just the Europeans are really quite concerned about doing this type of activity without the Americans holding their hand. I think evidence of this fairly recently has been the interdiction of Russian flagged but Venezuelan oil tankers. There's been a couple around the globe, and there was one that was interdicted off the coast of the UK fairly recently. And the UK and other Europeans have chosen not to interdict Shadow Fleet vessels for a long time. The legality of the action didn't change, but when the Americans wanted to do it, we supported. And since we've said, well, we should do that now, and we haven't. So I think that's pretty stark evidence whereby the Europeans, always have traditionally taken a lead from the Americans. My concern over sort of potential future military deployments to Ukraine, which I'll talk about in detail in a moment, is that Europeans have not done well using the military instrument outside of Europe. Since the Cold War, it's pretty much always been failure. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, obviously NATO operations, a variety of European missions in the Sahel, stabilization in the Balkans, but only after the worst of the violence. So even when the Americans are heavily involved, we haven't done very well. And then when the Americans have led from the back, as they did in Libya, we haven't done very well. And now we're suddenly sort of politically deciding to potentially go into a pretty significant operation with very, I'd say, grave consequences. And we're in a real sort of dilemma surrounding it. So, and I think this is where we have to split out. So when coalition of the willing is talked about in terms of this sort of this grouping, which is ostensibly UK, France led, I see that more of actually a coalition of the willing is in terms of support to Ukraine, both politically, economic, military, and humanitarian. And actually there's a good news story, because as the Americans have started to reduce support to Ukraine, the Europeans have stabilized by significantly increasing, certainly in terms of financial and humanitarian support. So I see that as the coalition of the willing. Within that, there's a potential multinational force Ukraine, which is the military operation, which would be commanded by the UK and France. And I think you have to delineate the two. We sort of join them up a little bit. So I think the coalition of willing, the general support to Ukraine, all good. And, signs are that the Europeans will sort of continue that and take that burden on with the US changing. The military operation, I think, needs a lot more work. And I think the position we are now is politically we're ready to go, or at least the leaders of the country are ready to go. But we still don't actually know what the mission is, because we don't have a ceasefire. We don't actually understand everything that Mariana was just talking about there. And again, speaking as an ex-military person, you need a mission before you can start to plan. So for that, I think, the potential deployment is very dangerous, despite the fact that the general, obviously, sort of political declarations is wanting to do something to continue to support Ukraine.
Thank you, Ed. Now, Mariana, turning to you, as a leading nuclear expert, there's perhaps no more strategic question than the NATO nuclear umbrella. But given the doubts that we've heard about American commitments to European security, we've seen in recent weeks that talk of a European nuclear deterrent, independent of American backing, is becoming increasingly popular among both leaders and the public. Stepping aside from the detail of the Ukraine conflict for a moment and looking at this bigger strategic military question, how would the absence of an American nuclear umbrella, if that was to become a formal problem rather than the doubt that it currently is, how would that absence affect European geopolitics? And touching on this idea of a coalition of the willing, could there be a French-British led substitute? Is that realistic? And what might it look like? Perhaps just to add a little bit of context, we're expecting quite an important intervention from President Macron on the 2nd of March, where he will address France's nuclear security posture. But more broadly, what could we possibly expect as a European alternative, and is it feasible?
Well, there are various schools of thought on that. It is certainly clear that the Europeans, or any kind of British, French condominium, cannot substitute the kind of extended deterrence that the United States currently provides to its European NATO allies. It just doesn't have the scope of these forces, but also the structure of NATO planning group and NATO forces in Europe is such that, it is always the American four-star general that's the supreme allied commander, and Edward will probably know a lot more about that, who is also the commander of U.S. forces in Europe. And there's a reason for that, because then in the contingency, he can call on the U.S. nuclear fire, right? That's the backstop and the ultimate security guarantee. So I think for that to shift, there would literally have to be a major shift of command structures within NATO in Europe, and a withdrawal of the forward deployed forces in 6 locations in NATO. And then, the question becomes, well, to what extent can the British and the French fill that void? There's certainly some minimal existential sort of deterrent that could be provided by the very existence of nuclear weapons on the French and British side, especially if they could figure out a way of jointly kind of delivering or managing that deterrent. A combination of the two is a credible minimal deterrent, right? UK has sea-based deterrent, the nuclear submarines, and France has the air leg and also I think a sea-based leg. But UK nuclear deterrent is very greatly dependent on the United States. So then the question becomes, well, can UK disentangle? Can it sort of indigenize fully its nuclear program? I think what is a more productive way of thinking about deterrence in Europe is bolstering conventional forces with strategic effect, right? There are systems today that can deliver strategic sort of deterrence in a way by conventional means. And the best indication of that are actually changes to the Russian nuclear doctrine that were affected back in the fall of 2024, where one of the scenarios for permissible nuclear use were augmented on the Russian side by this sort of combined massive air, drone space attack that was envisioned. In that particular case, Russians told us essentially what would deter them, right? What thou shalt not do in order to incur a response, a nuclear response. And so that is, if we reverse these scales, we can understand that also given the changes on the battlefield in Ukraine, the advance of technologies, we see the role of long-range drones, we see the role of conventionally armed, high explosives, long fires that can degrade critical infrastructure, but also hold at risk strategic bases. I mean, Ukrainians were able to do that in Operation Spiderweb with a bunch of very low-tech, drones and a container in which it was contained. So I think there are other ways to think about deterrence for the Europeans than defaulting to nuclear component and trying to somehow replace what the United States has been providing.
Thank you, Mariana. And Oleksandra, coming to you maybe for a closer look at the domestic defense picture in Ukraine. It was touched upon there that Ukraine's military and homegrown capacity has been transformed since 2022. The country's become a leader in very cutting edge areas of military technology like drone warfare, as well as cultivating significant in-house artillery production. I'm curious, as someone who's been intimately involved in the military armament side of things in Ukraine, how has this domestic resilience, this domestic capacity been achieved in practice? And maybe you could also tell us a bit about the lessons that Europe could draw from Ukraine's example as it seeks to rearm at pace.
Basically, let's start with the numbers to show just the scale of the growth. So in 2021,
Oleksandra, sorry, we're just having a bit of trouble hearing you. Maybe you could increase your volume.
Okay, maybe you can hear me now. Good.
A bit better, yeah.
Sorry. So let's start with the numbers to just explain the growth. So in 2021, the overall amount of the defense production in Ukraine was around 1.5 billion US dollars. Now it's more than 16 billions, and some of the researchers are showing even bigger results. The official numbers of the existing capacity, it's around 36 billions. It's like an incredible growth. If we're looking into the number of the companies, it was less than 100 defense industry companies. Now it's like more than 1,000. And more importantly, just to see the reliance on our own production on the battlefield now, more than 60% of the everything being used is Ukrainian made. And on the drones, it's 96% of all the drones are being produced in Ukraine. Obviously, with a huge reliance on the China components, but still, so it's being accomplished here. And to explain how it works from the innovations point of view, because that was even more important than just the scaling. The 2025, there was more than 1,400 new items officially registered by the Ministry of Defense as a new products. And the timeline for the products to be updated, both from the software and the hardware, in some of the companies can be between 3 days to 1 month. So that's just really something which we generalize as a defense R&D as a part of the fight. That's really the type of the concept we are trying to frankly speaking, just conceptualize what's already happening, because it happened not because someone really planned it. It happened because of the whole nation answer, because it was not only civilians entering into the army and changing the army according to the more, the civil society rules, but it was also a lot of the private companies who never were the part of the defense industry before, jumping into the sector and transforming it. I'm talking first of all about the IT, but also heavy machinery, but also companies which used to produce some of the pharmaceutical, and now is doing energetics for the explosives. So that's type of the transformation we have. And if we're talking about the reasons, there were some things which were very structural. For example, it was initiative coming from the Ministry of Digital Transformation to introduce the accelerator called Brain1, which really allowed to seed grant all different type of the startups and innovations companies, so then they can grow and actually to be part of the contractors of the Ministry of Defense. The institutionally very important was to have not only the centralized procurement, but decentralized procurement on the level of the brigades, on the level of the different defense forces, and on the level of the charitable foundations. Ukrainian charitable foundations, which are basically the NGOs, like a civilian-led initiatives, they are the best procurement agency now for the front line. So it's also, those type of the things when you're not just having ability to invite everyone to contribute to the sector, but also when you have decentralized money sources, that's very obvious reason how it started to be this way. And yes, again, coming back just to the overall understanding that it's fight for everyone, and we all need to engage somehow and to be that. As a new development for the defense industry, our former Minister of Digital Transformation now is the Minister of Defense. Again, keep complementing this new team because it's really like a huge change. They have this type of the digital transformation approaches now being introduced in the army, now being introduced in the MOD. Like as everywhere, Ukrainian defense sector is super conservative, but frankly speaking, they having no other choices but to be even more transformed than it was in the beginning of the 2022. So those are the numbers, a lot of innovations. As always, it's already happens like a sixth time when Ukrainians are better than Russians in innovating, but Russians are better in scaling up. So the only call to action I have for today's panel is actually to keep talking and persuading the governments of the European nations to build the joint ventures, the co-production with Ukrainians, either on Ukrainian territory, which is just cheaper, either on the Europe territory, which is of course safer, but not always, given the fact how actively Russia is working on the Europe's territory with the sabotage and many other type of the attacks and hybrid war already happening on the Europe's territory. But the fact is the fact. If we're really serious about considering Ukraine as a part of the Europe security, and just I'm gonna quote here General Christopher Donahue, who said that in Wiesbaden summer last year, to make sure that Ukraine is a part of the Eastern Flank deterrence line, it's just our only, like a way to go forward. And by saying that, he was very pragmatic, saying that Europe needs to choose one, like a basic type of the platforms we're fighting, and Europe should really make Ukraine part of the supply chains. But for that, to allow our UGVs, unmanned ground vehicles, to keep growing, it would be wonderful to have some of the German, French, and other companies, automotive industry, just to take it, buy the license, and start producing it on the European, ground. Because now, for example, with the UGV, this specific capability, we are leading. We are better than Russians. But as again, it can be that in upcoming 6 months, they will take the leadership because they're better than the scaling up. So please support Ukrainian defense industry by investments, co-production, just doing it together. Thank you.
Thank you, Oleksandra. So it's clear that there's some military cooperation between Ukraine and European countries which needs to be put in place. But on the broader topic of European integration, I'd like to turn our attention to the final round of questions for today's webinar, Ukraine's European future, more broadly. Many will remember the powerful scenes from Euromaidan in 2014 when Ukrainians waved EU flags as a symbolic expression of their ambitions and hopes for their country. Ukraine's European journey and the Russian aggression it faces seem to be interwoven. And while Ukraine has paid a high price for its aspirations, perversely, its place at the European top table may seem now to have more political backing than ever as a result of the current conflict. I'd like to turn to Mariana first to ask about this bigger question about Ukraine's future in Europe. Kyiv has been pushing for a fast track to EU membership, and in principle, many in Europe seem supportive of the idea. In practice, what would Ukraine joining the EU mean for the balance of power in Europe and beyond? I'm thinking in particular of how Russia might react to such a development.
Let me just start by saying that, I go between Ukraine and the United States all the time, and I note always this this disconnect between the way that Ukrainians see themselves and maybe Ukraine is seen from the outside, including in Europe. Ukrainians already see themselves as a part of Europe. Maybe not institutionally integrated and with official memberships, but they see themselves as fighting for ultimately the very things Europe stands for. You mentioned the revolution of dignity. This is when it all started, right? It didn't start with Ukraine's aspiration of NATO membership, as some of the people like to allege. It all started with Ukraine wanting to integrate with Europe. and rejecting the kind of model of governance that has taken place in Russia and has been instituted in Russia, this very horizontal, the one that snuffs out all kind of semblance of deliberative politics, right? Ukrainians wanted agency in their own affairs. So yes, in a way, that's one of the big Ukrainian wins, that despite this terrible war, the process of integration, formal integration with Europe is underway. There certainly, has been a lot of written and studied about EU bureaucratic politics. You guys are sitting there in Brussels. You probably know this better than most of us, that a lot of it is quite cumbersome. And, there's a lot of red tape. And so forth. And there's a hope that perhaps in this moment of urgency, some of that could be better streamlined. However, there are real reforms that need to happen in Ukraine, right? It would not be much of a service to the Ukrainian people who have been trying to get their country in shape and root out some of the corruption that still exists, some of the, issues with the justice systems, with all sorts of things that, they're hoping there would be pressure from above, from the partners, European partners, to get that changed, to see that country actually live up to its full potential. So, as much as there's pressure to streamline and expedite Ukraine's accession, it should not be done at the expense of getting some real reforms instituted and done in Ukraine that would benefit the country in the long term. Now, absorbing Ukraine into the European Union is a big task, right? It's a big country. Even without the war and the kinds of kind of disruptions and problems that creates in its own right, it's a huge agricultural producer, right? There has to be a different kind of approach within the common EU agricultural policy that is its own set of woes, right? To accommodate such a huge agricultural producer in the European market. We've already seen what happens when some of the Ukrainian produce gets into Europe with the Polish farmers and so forth. So as much as Ukraine needs to reform and get its own kind of stuff in shape to be able to access, Europe also has to think of how to change itself to accommodate and be able to absorb such a large unit, right? It's not Montenegro. No offense to Montenegrins, of course. So I'm not really an expert in EU integration politics, but these seem to be kind of some of the big questions that need to be considered in the process.
On that point, I'd like to pass direct to Oleksandra. As a former minister, you've probably been inside the conversations about the EU accession procedure, or at least some of the efforts to meet the criteria for accession. How do you assess the Ukrainian government's ability to actually meet these criteria, especially in the very short timescale which President Zelensky has proposed?
I would definitely agree with Mariana that reforms are needed both ways. We also keep joking that's the only way for UK to come back is join efforts with Ukraine and just to hug somehow the continent from two sides, like east and west. So it's definitely will be needed. Again, just looking into the things and the basic calculations, how many of the Ukrainians members of the European Parliament will be if it all happens, this way. So there are a lot of, the questions to decide on. But if they're going to be properly discussed and transparent understanding of what the rules are, what the stages are, of course, it's possible. And I'm even with the fact that we do have a lot of the challenges with the corruption, we do not deny it. We're trying to fight it. And I'm very proud about the anti-corruption architecture, which was established in Ukraine and showing its efficiency even during the wartime. I keep saying to my special American friends who are asking about, next round of the corruption scandal, saying like, can you imagine Pash Patel to investigate Trump now? Like, obviously not, but it's kind of happening in Ukraine in wartime. And that's something for what we are fighting for. So yes, obviously super challenging, but yes, it is possible. It is just necessary. And I do believe we will do it if we will be able to build a dialogue from the different sides. What really worries me now when we're looking into the timeline, we have this beautiful EU loan, like in 19 billions, which is, of course, we really hope to have Russian money to be used to finance our defense. But again, EU money also very good, very grateful. But looking into these numbers, we do understand that it's 2 years timeline to actually, that's a very narrow window of opportunities. Just have a look on the timeline of the elections in European Union with all understanding how Russians are actually involving in them and investing billions in their cognitive warfare inside EU. So that's what worries me, that I'm worried that we are not aware of the time. And yes, Ukrainians are resilient, but Ukrainians are resilient while they're still alive. And yes, that's already, like 4 years, and there's still a lot of resilience in the society. But the money and the political cycles beyond Ukraine, that's what really matters.
Thank you, Oleksandra. I'm going to pass to Ed for the final word on this, but before, I'd like to remind everyone that you are free to ask questions to our panel in the chat. My colleague will be selecting a few and we will ask them at the end of the conversation. But before that, Ed, on the same topic, Russia obviously has vetoed Ukrainian membership of NATO. That's one of their very clear red lines as part of any peace negotiations. But when it turns to the EU, is EU accession the best option for guaranteeing Ukraine's security and its European future in the medium term? Or are there intergovernmental or ad hoc arrangements which can maybe deliver some of the same outcomes more feasibly? I think, for example, of the European political community, which has become a fixture of the diplomatic calendar over the past few years. What's your take on the best way forward? Is EU membership really the panacea which Ukraine seeks?
I mean, I think just first on the sort of the element that we've just talked about in terms of reforms and corruption, I do think that there is an element whereby the countries that make up the EU or NATO hold Ukraine to higher standards than our own. Okay, I'm British. I'm from the UK. We're no longer in the EU, but look at the front pages of our headlines in terms of the potential corruption that's been going on for potentially quite a while in our own country. I do think we need to sort of readdress that pretty quickly. And then I think when you're talking about security, I mean, NATO is obviously what Ukraine wants, but I really do think that the opportunity was missed. I think the sort of the last point which Ukraine could have been offered was at the Washington summit last year. Because actually, if you read the North Atlantic Treaty under Article 10 of the invite and Article 11 under ratification, once you invite, there's nothing to suggest that you can withdraw an invitation. So actually doing it at that point would then put control on ratification, which you could then also use as a potential bargaining chip against Russia, i.e. Russia's behavior is not as we wanted. So you then go down the ratification and it's still ultimately the US would hold the power on that. And actually, although Russia has sort of vetoed it in these latest documents we've discussed, I mean, effectively NATO has vetoed Ukrainian accession for a long time, and it's been mismanaged for a long period. So if NATO's not an option, what else is? The EU, I mean, that is absolutely critical for economically rebuilding the country. I think from a security aspect, that's less certain, particularly around sort of the worries that the EU would have around Article 42.7 mutual defence clause. So I think for security, that's still difficult. And there's a variety of other intergovernmental ad hoc potential. I mean, you mentioned the the European Political Community, EPC, there's the Nordic Baltic 8, there's a Coalition of Willing we've talked about, Joint Expeditionary Force. There's a variety of frameworks, but the issue is they can only really provide political, economic support. They would all fall short of that military support as well that Ukraine wants. So, the EU membership's not a silver bullet. I think it would be very important for helping the country rebuild, but those, the security questions are likely to have to be decided elsewhere. And what I think NATO particularly hasn't realized, but other countries also not realized, is like Ukraine is unique. We have tried for a variety of years, particularly after the full-scale invasion, to just treat Ukraine like another country, like it was North Macedonia trying to join NATO. It's not. It is unique. And if it is unique, you have to look at your processes and go, well, these don't work. We've got to try something else. And I think we're still trying to work out what that is. And if there is a potential peace deal, or sort of there is movement in that regard, I think having flexibility on the side of the Europeans is paramount.
Thank you very much, Ed. So I'll now turn to questions from the audience. I see that we have one already from Willemijn Krans, who works on resilience and civil military cooperation at the Dutch Ministry of Defense. And I think this is probably a question for you, Oleksandra. He was wondering, are there any examples of how private companies are aiding the military in vital sectors such as energy and mobility? Were these already in effect in peacetime, or have they increased over the course of the war? So examples of private companies aiding the military.
So the question is, so private companies turning into the defense. Yeah, so there's a lot of examples. Let me think about the ones which is the public knowledge. Because they do prefer not to mention it. If you don't mind, I will tell you the examples, but without exact names. So company number A was one of the leading companies by providing the technical and software solutions for the home securities. This company became one of the top producers of the FPV drones, really like a robotized production, very, very high level standards, and trying to go as much as possible from the Chinese components, which is super challenging, obviously, but still we're looking into that. Second case, it's as I said, like this pharmaceutical producer who started to produce energetics for the explosives. So cannot share the exact name, but I find the example quite fascinating. And really just a bunch of the different IT companies who either opened their own branches or some subsidiary companies and started to build not just software for the equipment, but hardware as well. There are really a lot of them. It's an interesting question how to move forward and look how they can go back from defense to civilian, especially for the drones. There are a lot of the developments, and of course, like the sector grew so much, but the next challenge for them going to be when hopefully some kind of the post will happen, and we will keep building capabilities as a deterrence, obviously, monitoring and everything, but still it won't be the type of the budgets we have now. And that's going to be the next stage, how we can, look into the coming back into the civil sector.
And thank you. Obviously, sorry. Please go ahead.
No, it's fine.
I was just going to say, obviously, there's a clear limitation in terms of confidentiality. Ed, maybe if I can bring you in on a kind of more broad question from the wider European perspective. Sorry to put you on the spot, but in terms of interactions between the private sector without military function, so for example, energy or IT companies, how would you assess the European readiness to adapt to military needs, given that in many cases we're struggling to meet our defense requirements even militarily? Is there an awareness among the European private sector that there may be potential military conversions of what they're working on?
Yes, I think so. And there's a lot of companies that are sort of in this business now, not just European, transatlantic as well. And I think it's really a mixed picture over sort of European NATO members. Some do this better just from a sort of cultural perspective. There are certain countries, I think the Nordics in particular are very good at sort of getting more bang for their buck and sort of using technology. I think other countries such as the UK actually slow. You have countries who have traditionally been very highly bureaucratic, like the Germans, who are, they are in the process of changing their procurement practices, and I think from where they started, they're doing quite well. But these things are quite slow. And I think the issue with sort of bringing in the private sector, which is absolutely essential, it's for NATO anyway, it's this difficulty that I sort of alluded to earlier. So the tactical adaptation cycle on the battlefield can be sort of 6 to 8 weeks at the moment. So how does NATO work out what capabilities it might need in 2030? Which is when NATO assesses it could be at war with Russia. Very, very difficult. So it's actually less about those specific requirements. It's about how to scale once you have them. And that might be in a couple of years' time. And I think that is the comparative advantage that NATO does have against Russia. I mean, we are learning a lot about how the Russians fight, which is not very good, but we're also trying to work out how they are going to adapt. And then once we try and understand that, that's exactly the time to get the private sector involved.
Thanks, Ed. And just one more brief question for you before we round up from Andrew Gray. Is there anything more that European countries could realistically give Ukraine right now in terms of military aid that would make a real difference on the battlefield? And do they have the stockpiles to do so?
I mean, it's long range strike capabilities and intelligence support, really. The ability, I mean, Oleksandra talked about this in her presentation, being able to target more Russian capabilities further away, then sort of putting the military cost on them in terms of how to do operations. That's pretty critical. Stockpiles, they are dwindling, but in some regards, such as Scalp and Storm Shadow, which has been effective, they're now effectively re-entered production. There are other capabilities. There's a variety of capabilities, in fact, across Russia that they are sort of preparing for, but it's really this issue that, again, it's the permissions aspect. I mean, we could provide lots of things to Ukraine tomorrow, and I believe we should, but we're quite slow to do this based on permissions, sort of escalation management with the Russians, especially as sort of there is this parallel track of diplomacy going on, that maybe now is not the time to do that, or that is certainly the perception.
Thank you, Ed. Mariana, you mentioned you mentioned a reply in the chat about air defenses. Maybe you want to just briefly say a couple of words on that for Andrew, and then we'll conclude the conversation.
Yeah, just to say that Ukrainians have been pretty successful in substituting some of the weapon systems that they weren't getting from the West in time or in the scale that they needed. One thing that's most difficult to substitute is air defense systems, and they are very, very much needed. And just a few words towards the first question on the energy side. What Ukrainian war or the Russo-Ukrainian war exposed that actually all of Europe is ill-equipped to defend their energy systems, that some of the production of the key equipment, such as auto transformers, has been outsourced to places like China. And the stocks of spare parts and repair, to be able to quickly repair some of this critical equipment, was just simply not available. And so that is there's a need to rethink what are some of the strategic components that need to be kept in-house. And that is a task also for this kind of a state and civilian interaction.
Thank you so much, Mariana. So with that, I will bring this conversation to an end. I'd like to thank our panelists once again for taking the time to share their expertise and insights with us. I hope you found it to be a stimulating conversation on this very important day. Thank you also for everyone who attended. And if you enjoyed this conversation, don't hesitate to follow the Brussels Institute for Geopolitics on social media, or sign up to our mailing list, which you can do for free via our homepage to receive all the latest geopolitical insights from here in Brussels. Thank you so much to everyone, and I wish you a pleasant afternoon and the rest of your day. Bye-bye.